Well, thank you very much. This is weird. I can hardly see everybody. First of all, when people applaud before you've said anything, you should just sit down, because it won't get any better than that. I do want to say a couple of thank yous. Whoops. First of all, I'm here partly because a dear friend of mine, Ken Carter, who is a former teacher here, his first job teaching was here at the school, and his wife, Helen Lansdowne, invited us to come and speak at the oratory. And I also want to thank Dr. Julian Murphy for his kind introduction and invitation. I'm going to take you back into the past before we get to the present and the future. And I want you to think for just a minute. Many people express a discomfort with what they think is the rate at which technology is evolving. It is breezing past you at a very high speed. New things keep happening. You have to learn new applications and the like, and it disturbs a lot of people. And they think that this 21st century is racing along faster than in earlier times. And I want you to just imagine for a moment that it's 1895. The school by this time was about 40 years old, if I remember my math correctly. Henri Becquerel in 1895 has just discovered radioactivity with X-rays. His film was getting fogged and he couldn't understand why. So that's, imagine, radioactivity, which didn't exist or wasn't known until then. And then electric and internal combustion cars were beginning to show up in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Now imagine that all you've ever done is ride a horse or a carriage. Suddenly these things are capable of running without benefit of horses. Or maybe better put, they had multiple horses, but they were called internal combustion engines. Then, 6 years from 1895, Marconi demonstrates that you don't need the transatlantic cable to send telegraph messages. He does it wirelessly in 1901. And this is just shocking. 8 years later, from 1895, the Wright brothers show it's possible for heavier than air aircraft to fly. Now, imagine if all you've ever thought about was a hot air balloon. The fact that something heavier than air can fly just seems magical. And then 10 years later, in 1905, Professor Einstein destroys Newtonian physics with his new theory of relativity. So I suggest to you that people who were living during that period of time were probably just as shocked as we might feel today in the 21st century with these dramatic new developments. And of course, as we go further into the 20th century, we'll see television, the atomic bomb, transistors, computers, microwave ovens, and all kinds of other things. And in the second half, which many of us have lived through, the discovery of DNA, which was done here in the UK, more computers, magnetic resonance imaging, Ethernet, optical networks, the internet, World Wide Web, dark matter and dark energy. By the way, I just have to tell you that when young people come to me and they say, what should I study? I tell them astrophysics. And they wonder why. And it's very easy to explain that. 100 years ago, we thought we knew everything there was to know about the way the universe worked. All we needed to do was to measure the physical constants more accurately, and we could predict everything. And then along comes Einstein, and he blows up, Newton, and then the quantum theory guys blow up Einstein, and then the string theory guys blow up the quantum theory guys. Here it is, 2024. What do we know about how the universe works? We know about how 5% of it works. Ordinary matter and antimatter. That's 5% of the universe. 25% of the universe is something called dark matter. We have no idea what that is. 75% of the universe is dark energy. We don't know what that is either. So if you go into astrophysics, the probability of getting the Nobel Prize is extremely high because we don't know anything. So just in case you were looking for some advice about your academic career. Okay, history of the internet. It starts out with this little 4-node system The first node was at UCLA, and I was a graduate student at the time, working on the Sigma 7 computer, trying to figure out how to get those little blue dots interconnected with each other and get the computers that were connected to the blue dots all talking to each other. The Sigma 7 machine is in a museum somewhere, and some people think I should be in the museum too, but here I am. This was a small 4-node network, and it was intended to do two things. The first thing it was trying to do was to connect different kinds of computers together, because the Defense Department was funding research in artificial intelligence back then in the 60s. And the universities that were doing the research needed to share their computing resources and their software, and the only way to do that was to have a network. Now, the networking of the day that was popular at the time was the telephone network. And all of you may know that it used a technology called circuit switching. Basically, you dial a number, and an electrical circuit gets set up, and the phone rings, and somebody picks up the phone, and the circuit stays up while they're talking until someone hangs up. Well, the scientists of that era looked at the method, and they said, this is going to be really slow. The computer has to dial up another computer. The computer has to answer the phone. You send some data, then you hang up, then you dial another computer. It takes too long. So instead, they decided to explore a new technology called packet switching, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this is an experiment to test that technology and to also test whether people could share their resources. This is how big a packet switch looked. This is the size of a refrigerator. And it was delivered to UCLA in September of 1969, encased in heavy metal. Now, oh, by the way, I should tell you, this was being sponsored by the Defense Department, and the manufacturers of this packet switch knew it was going to be delivered into a highly hostile territory, that is to say, a university with graduate students in it. And so they decided they needed to encase it in something very solid and protective. Today, of course, something with this kind of power is in your pocket, or maybe in your watch. But back then, it was like this. It's also important to know that as we were beginning to experiment with this technology, we realized how powerful it might be for the Defense Department to use computers to manage their resources, either in peacetime or in war. And the idea here is that a computer could be used to manage the resources of the military more efficiently than an opponent who didn't have the same resources. And so, in fact, if we could manage our resources more efficiently, we might be able to overcome an opposing force that was bigger but not as well managed. So that was part of the motivation. But as you think your way through that, you realize that the computers would have to be in mobile vehicles, in ships at sea, and airplanes. And that little 4-node network that I showed you was connected by dedicated telephone circuits connecting the various computers together. Wires don't work with airplanes. You know, they never make it off the tarmac. The ships get all tangled up, and the tanks run over the wires and they break. So we had to shift to radio and satellite communication in order to build a network that could deal with mobility and airborne and shipborne communication. So this nondescript looking van was built for a packet radio system that was built in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in fact, there's a story that the engineers that were testing these radios, let me show you a picture of the radios. See these white boxes in there? Those boxes were a cubic foot, and they cost $50,000 each. Today, your mobile does more than what that big giant piece of equipment did. But at the time, we're talking in the early 1970s, this was very advanced technology. So that packet radio van that I showed you, this one, used to drive up and down the San Francisco Bayshore Freeway, testing to see whether or not our packets would be successfully delivered. And every once in a while, they would just pull off to the side of the freeway, and they would start running tests. And the driver, who was an engineer, would get out and go into the back where all the equipment was. So one day there's a police car driving by and it sees this unmarked van that looks like this with a stacked dipole radio antenna on the top. There's nobody in the cab. So he knocks on the back door. The door is open and he sees a bunch of bearded geeks with radio equipment and displays and terminals and everything else. And he says, "Who are you?" And somebody says, "Oh, we work for the government." And he looks at them and he says, "Which government?" "But officer, we were only going 50 kilobits per second." Now, remember, I told you that we were doing this work in order to help build a command and control system for the Defense Department. And so that means not just data, but voice and video. So way back in the 1970s, we started experimenting with something called packetized voice. Now, in the telephone system, when you digitize voice, it turns into a 64,000 bit per second signal. You take 8,000 samples of 8 bits each, do the math, 64,000 bits a second. The backbone speeds of this system were between 50 kilobits and 100 kilobits. You can't put very much 64 kilobit voice into a 100 kilobit channel. So we got smart. We said, let's take that digitized voice stream and let's compress it to a much smaller number of bits. So how do we do that? Well, we had a little algorithm that modeled the voice track as if it were a stack of cylinders and that were being excited by a formant frequency, a pitch. And so we would send the voice track model is these cylinders whose diameter is changing as you're speaking, and we would send 9 parameters to the other side, plus the formant frequency, and it would invert the sound, invert the digitized model, and produce sound. Well, when you move something from 64 kilobits a second down to 1,800 bits a second, you kind of disturb the quality of the speech. And so anyone who spoke through the system would sound like a drunken Norwegian. And when I was running the program, I remember being asked to demonstrate this to a bunch of generals at the Pentagon, and I was trying to think, how am I going to do this? And then I remembered that one of the people working on packetized voice was Ingvar Lund from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. So I asked Ingvar to speak through the ordinary Autovan telephone system that the military used, and then I asked him to talk through the packetized voice system, and it sounded exactly the same. I didn't tell the generals that everybody would sound that way if they talked through the system. In 1994, 3 of us who had worked on the ARPANET project were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET, and we wanted to emphasize how primitive it was at the time. And I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but it took us all day to set up this shot. We had to go find the yellow squash and the green zucchini and the 5-pound tins of coffee, which we had to empty out. So we put all this stuff together, and then we drew a big backdrop to show where parts of the ARPANET had been running. This was for Newsweek magazine. Now, I want you to notice that there is an embedded geek joke in this picture, because if you look carefully, you'll notice that it's mouth to mouth and ear to ear. There is no mouth to ear. This network would never work. And that was our present to the geeks who were reading Newsweek magazine at the time. What we learned from the ARPANET and later the internet design is that it was a good idea to build this like a layer cake. Each layer had a function. The lowest layers were the physical layers, like optical fibers and radio links and things like that, Ethernet. The next layer up organized the bits into frames. The next layer up organized the frames into internet packets. You could think of them as little postcards. And then the layer above that organized the sequence of packets in order to make sure they stayed in order, they got reproduced, or duplicates were filtered out, and so on. And then on top of that is an application like the sort of thing that you use today in the World Wide Web and the browsers that are so common. So this layering idea is super important to organize the complex system that we were building. So here's something kind of weird. Ignorance turns out to be a virtue in this internet design. The internet packets, which you can think of as electronic postcards, because a postcard has a to address and a from address and some content. The same is true of internet packets. But the packets have no idea how they're being carried. They don't know if it's a radio link, an optical link, a fiber, an Ethernet, or something else, a satellite link. And we did that on purpose, because when new technologies were invented to carry these packets, we didn't want the system to have to change. And because the packets are ignorant of how they're being carried, new transmission capabilities could be added to the system without any further change in the higher layers. The other interesting ignorance is that these packets that are carrying bits, just like a postcard carries content, don't have any idea what the bits mean, just like a postcard doesn't know what you wrote on it. Why is that valuable? Well, that means that when somebody adds a new application, the interpretation of the bits only happens at the end, where the host computers are. The underlying network doesn't have a clue what anything means. And that's wonderful, because when someone invents a new application, you don't have to change the network at all, because it doesn't know and it doesn't care what the bits mean. So you can even add new protocols at each of those layers. So as an example, Sir Tim Berners-Lee invented a new layer of protocol for the internet called the World Wide Web, the Hypertext Transmission Protocol. And he was able to add that without asking permission of anyone, because the layering allowed that flexibility and freedom. And so among the various things that make the internet so successful is its flexibility to expand functionality. Anyone who wants to is free to invent a new protocol or invent a new layer. Is something wrong?
Lost the connection there.
Oh. So much for... Do I have to genuflect every 5 minutes or something to make this work? Okay. Thank you. This is tech support again. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. So let's go just a little deeper here. There's something interesting about the postcard analogy that actually works really well. So once you understand the postcard analogy, you'll actually understand how the internet works. So think about what you know about postcards. Well, the first thing you know is it has a to address, a from address, and some content. And you know that when you put a postcard in the post box, there's no guarantee it comes out the other end. This is called best efforts communication. That's what your post office does. That's what our post office does. If you put two postcards in the post box, all aimed at the same destination, there's no guarantee that they come out in the same order you put them in. This is also true of internet packets, so they can get out of order. The internet even does something that the post office doesn't do. Sometimes you put an internet packet in, and you get two copies out, because the network may have thought that something got lost and it retransmitted it to make sure that everything gets there. So at the receiving end, you may lose packets, you may get packets out of order, and you may get duplicates. And it would be perfectly okay for you sitting there thinking, why would anybody in the world want to have something like this working with lossy, and disorderly arrival? And the answer is that we did that on purpose for that layer of protocol, because it was very important to get packets to the other end quickly for certain applications, especially things like speech and video, and oh, by the way, radar. I mean, you want to know where the missile is now. You don't want to know where it was. So you don't want to bother retransmitting old data for tracking a missile. You want the most recent information you can get. So this IP layer is very swift, even if it's not guaranteed. So you put another layer on top, which we call the transmission control protocol, and its job is to put everything back in order, filter out the duplicates. And the easiest way to see how that works is to imagine that you have a post office that only delivers postcards, and you have a book that you want to send to your friend, and the only way you can deliver the book is using postcards. So what would you do? Well, you tear the pages out of the book, you cut them up to fit on the postcards, and then you'd notice that not every page has a number because you cut them up, and you know they could get out of order, so you number all the postcards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you know that they might get lost, and so you keep copies just in case you have to retransmit them. So far, so good. And then you get this brilliant idea. How do you know that your friend got everything that you're sending, and he sends you a postcard that says, I got everything up to postcard number 420. And then you realize that postcard might get lost. And so you think, what do I do now? And the answer is you look at your watch, and if you haven't heard anything back, you start sending duplicates until you finally do get a postcard from your friend that says, I got everything up to postcard number 420. Almost done. You almost know how the internet works. There's one other little fact that you should know. What if you had a 1,000-page book, and you decide to cut it up into 2,000 postcards, and you go to the post office and you give them all 2,000 postcards, and they all get delivered on the same day at the same time to your friend's post box, which only holds 200 postcards. So the other 1,800 postcards fall on the ground and get blown away, or the dog eats them. So that's not going to work very well. So you have a deal with your friend. You say, I won't send you more than 200 postcards at a time until I get an acknowledgement back saying you got all of those. Then I'll send another 200. That's called flow control. Guess what? You now know how the internet works. I've left out some little details like how does the routing work and what's a domain name and how do you translate that into an IP address. But basically, that's how the internet works. Now, taking you back in time again, we built 3 networks in order to test our ideas. We had the mobile packet radio network that I talked to you about with the van that was going up and down the Bayshore Freeway. We built a satellite-based network using Intelsat 4A, which is over the Atlantic, connecting the western part of Europe to the eastern part of the US. And then we had the original ARPANET, which by that time, in 1977, stretched all the way into Europe through an internal satellite hop. So I was running the program at this point in Washington, and I desperately wanted to show everybody that this system of networks would actually deliver data successfully and reliably. So remember the van that was going up and down the Bayshore over on the left there. The van was transmitting packets that were sent from the packet radio network into the ARPANET all the way across to Europe, popped out of the ARPANET and went into the satellite network, went all the way over the Atlantic Ocean again, and then popped back into the ARPANET again in the US, and then all the way to Los Angeles to USC, Information Sciences Institute. Now, those of you who know your geography will know that San Francisco and Los Angeles are about 400 miles apart. But the packets went almost 100,000 miles because they went all the way up to synchronous satellite twice. And the synchronous satellite's 22,400 miles away from Earth, so that's 44,000 miles up and down. Second satellite hop is another 44,000 miles, that's 88.8, plus going back and forth across the United States. So the packets actually worked going 100,000 miles. I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I remember leaping out of my chair saying, it works, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. Any one of you who have done anything with software know it's a miracle when software works. And so I'm always astonished when the web pages come up whenever I'm doing surfing around in the internet, because I know all the stuff that had to happen before that page came back. Most other people just think, oh, of course it came there, because it works. Now, that was the Defense Department's contribution, but in the United States, in the mid-1980s, 3 other institutions became very excited about the possibility of connecting computers together in order to support their work. The National Science Foundation supports some 3,000 universities in the US to do their research. They wanted to connect those universities to 5 supercomputer centers that they were building, and they decided to use the TCP/IP internet technology to do that. The Department of Energy has labs around the United States, and they built the Energy Sciences Network, again using the same internet protocols in order to connect the labs together with all their computers. And NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, built the NASA Science Internet, linking all of its laboratories together, and then they interconnected all the networks together. So we had a growing number of networks and users during the mid-1980s. And of course, if we look at the internet today, it looks something like this. This was generated automatically by looking at all the things, the networks that are interconnected and the paths and interconnectivity that they have. The colors here just represent different networks. There are tens of thousands of networks in the internet. And the interesting thing about this picture is that every one of those networks is run independently of each other. So the networks decide what business model they want to use. Some are for-profit, some are non-profit, some are run by the government, some are private sector. They choose what hardware they want to use. They choose what software they're going to use. They choose who they'll connect with and on what terms and conditions. It's a totally distributed system. And the miracle of all this is that it works because they all use the same protocols. So standardization is the only way that the internet could possibly work. So this is what you see today, this gigantic global network operating in almost every country in the world. So where is all this technology taking us? I'm not going to go through every single line here, but you must be already very aware of things. We have laptops and pads and mobiles and smartphones. We have increasingly fast mobile telephone services, 3G, 4G, 5G, and 6G. We're adding computing power at the edges of those networks, in addition to having data centers in what's called cloud computing that is more like in the middle of the networks. You're using things like Bluetooth. You're using other near-field communication for your credit cards, for example. There are all kinds of devices that have internet capability built into them, like refrigerators and kitchen equipment and and automobiles and things like that. There are lots and lots of billions of things that are part of the net. The optical fiber networks are running at enormous speeds. Remember I mentioned the 50 kilobits a second in the early radio network? We're running 400 gigabits per second in each channel in an optical fiber, and there are multiple channels in each fiber. Capacity is huge. And there's a recent development here at the University of Southampton called hollow fiber. So instead of running the light through glass, which is what a typical fiber does, it's more like a long string of macaroni. That's not accurate, so don't tell the physicists I said that. But it basically, the light goes through atmosphere rather than going through glass. And that doubles the speed of light, because the speed of light in glass is 90,000 miles a second, but the speed of light in atmosphere is 186,000 miles a second. So you get lower latency with the hollow fiber and broader bandwidth. Those of you who know anything at all about the history of the internet might know that when Bob Kahn and I started the work, we didn't know how many things were going to be on the network, and we had to invent an addressing structure, and we called it IP version 4, Internet Protocol version 4. We had 32 bits of address. That is enough to label 4.3 billion devices. Now, please remember that we were making that decision in 1973. 4.3 billion is more people than there were in the whole world at the time. I thought, surely that's enough to do this experiment. Well, a few years later, around 1992 or so, it became very clear that the exploding number of networks and devices meant that we needed more address space to label everything. So we have a new protocol that's called IP version 6, which has 128 bits of address space. I'll do the math for you. It's 3.4 times 10 to the, holy moly, 36th, which is roughly 340 trillion addresses. That's enough to last until after I'm dead. Then it's somebody else's problem. So we're working on getting the version 6 protocol suite propagated throughout the network. Those of you who are studying any of the sciences, and even linguistics and history and everything else, will know that the term computational X for almost every value of X is becoming legitimate. Computational linguistics, computational biology, computational chemistry, computational astrophysics. We are using computers today to model the world that we live in. And so for almost every possible discipline, computers are becoming useful and have a role to play. And of course, many of you will have played with the large language models like ChatGPT or maybe Gemini or some of the others. Those are also becoming a very important part of our environment. Neural networking, multi-layer neural networking, which used to be laughed at in the 1960s, is now the mainstay of a lot of artificial intelligence work. You may remember in 2015, a company called DeepMind, which was formed here in the UK, wrote a program called AlphaGo, and it beat Lee Sedol, one of the grandmasters at Go, 4 games out of 5, which was dramatic. No one expected anything like that. And since that time, DeepMind has developed other algorithms, one of which is called AlphaFold. You all know that DNA, when it's interpreted, produces proteins. Those proteins are chains of amino acids. But the chains of amino acids that are produced when the messenger RNA goes into the ribosome and the amino acids pop out the other side, there's this little chain that forms a protein. But the protein doesn't stay as a chain, it folds itself up based on physics and low energy. The question is, how does it fold up? And if you know the shape of a protein, you have some idea of what it can do. So the AlphaFold team has now modeled 200 million proteins. So we know we have this giant dictionary of all the proteins that our DNA can produce. And that is very important because some of those molecules might turn out to be useful in combating a disease, for example. So we have all of those things happening to us, and I've already mentioned cloud computing and the like. New kinds of computing are also happening. Quantum computing, for example, is one of the latest efforts to try to harness entanglement in order to do computations that conventional computing couldn't do. So you're living in a world which is rapidly advancing on the computational axis. And data is also everywhere along with the computers. And I couldn't help but notice let's see if I can get yes, this is your little brochure, which I found in the meeting room, and I discovered on one page it says, data, 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 I cannot make bricks without clay. Sherlock Holmes. And that's actually very true. Data is everything. No matter what algorithm you have, if it has bad data, it doesn't work very well. And so we're seeing huge amounts of data becoming increasingly available. The problem is, if the data isn't any good, then the algorithms can't fix it. So getting really good quality data is super important for almost any application that you might have in mind. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but there are lots and lots of kinds of data that are being accumulated. Some of it's really important for health, for example. Being able to keep track on a continuous basis the state of your health is really important, because otherwise what happens is that the doctors only see you when you're sick. And so they get the impression that you're always sick because they never see you when you're healthy. They never have any data for you when you're healthy. They only have data for you when you're sick. If you have continuous monitoring, like some of you may have with your watches, for example, and with other devices, then we get an idea of what's your normal condition. And that's valuable to know, because if you deviate from your normal conditions, that might be a signal that you have an illness. So having that kind of data is super valuable in the health field, among others. So the whole point here is that data is becoming increasingly important in the world that we live in, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and applying the data. And in some sense, sometimes we want to keep the data private, especially your medical data or your financial data, so that other people don't have inappropriate access to it. Now, I have to tell you that there have been some unexpected consequences of the internet and the technologies that go with it. At least I didn't anticipate them, which is kind of embarrassing. We thought, when we were building this thing, that by dropping the barrier to access to information, by dropping the barrier to being able to share what you know, to help you find other people that have a common interest, that somehow this would be a positive thing. And in large measure, it has been. The problem here is that by expanding access to the net and dropping barriers down to access to information, we amplified everyone's access to this capability, including the bad guys. And so those of us who were designing the network were a bunch of computer geeks, and all we could think of was all the good stuff you could do with the network, and we weren't thinking about all the bad stuff that you could do. So now we have that problem. We have to face the fact that some of social media, for example, have feedback loops that drive people into the dark recesses of the network. There's increasingly extreme content coming from amplification and narrowing of focus. So we have to work on this. This is not a problem that's solvable just by technology. You really, really have to figure out what the sociology and psychology and neurophysics and neuropsychology and all of those other things that drive people to do some of these bad things. We have to understand that to deal with it. I will say that scale has also turned out to be a pretty big challenge. In YouTube, for example, I'm at Google, we run YouTube, we get 500 hours of video per minute uploaded into YouTube. 500 hours per minute uploaded into YouTube. God knows how much goes outbound. So that's hard to deal with. If somebody says, I want you to filter out all the bad stuff. Filtering out the bad stuff from 500 hours of video is not easy. If you try to automate it, you'll be using AI tools which don't necessarily always work right. So this is a big challenge. And of course, the challenge we have is that misinformation and disinformation propagate through the network, malware and ransomware and so on. And it's particularly difficult to deal with because the good guys may be in one country and the victims may be in one country and the perpetrators may be in another. So now we're talking about international relations and trying to arrange agreements between countries in order to hold people accountable for the bad things that they're doing in the online environment. So this is a big challenge. The UN just met in New York this past month, looking at agreements on an international basis to deal with harmful behaviors in the online environment. Now, to topic A, artificial intelligence. Everybody is exposed to that these days. I have to remind you, remember I said that the original ARPANET project was based on support for research in artificial intelligence among a collection of universities. So that was way back in the 1960s. We didn't really know how to do this, so we wrote programs that worked some of the time. It was called heuristic programming. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. If it worked all the time, that's engineering. If it doesn't work all the time, that's artificial intelligence. That didn't scale very well. And then we went to a new kind of system called expert systems, where you ask questions of people who are experts at something, and then you create a collection of statements of the if-then-else form. For example, if this symptom appears, then there is a probability that this person might have that disease. And if that's not the case, then you go on to some other if-then-else clauses. So the if-then-else clauses grew, tens of thousands of them, into this complex expert system. After a while, they started contradicting each other, and so that expert system design didn't scale very well. So that was the second era of artificial intelligence. The third one is today's world, which is made with hundreds of layers of neural networks that are essentially statistical machines that ingest a whole lot of information and then form a statistical model of what that information is like. There are machine learning. This is the large language models are a version of machine learning. Machine learning can sometimes work very reliably. So let me give you an example. At Google, we run data centers. They have a lot of computers in them, and they run hot. They use up a lot of power, and they create a lot of heat, so you have to cool them down in order to make them work. And so every week for a while, one engineer would try to figure out how to adjust the valves and the pumps of the water cooling system to keep the data centers at a temperature so the computers could work. But it was a very sluggish, kind of not very responsive system to do this once a week. Someone said, why don't we train a machine learning model to try to reduce the amount of power required to cool the data center? So they trained a model to control the valves and the pumps, and they saved 40% of the power required to cool the data center. So that's a machine learning application that really worked well. There are others that work equally well for machine translation, for example. Google has a translation service called translate.google.com. It translates over 200 languages back and forth into each other using large language models for that purpose. So there are many things that actually work well, but there are a few things that don't. So it's okay to use these large language models, for example, just for entertainment. You could prompt one of the systems to maybe write you a little story. I did that. I asked it to write a story about an alien that got into my wine cellar and was drinking my Cabernet Sauvignon. So it wrote a nice little 1,000-word story. It didn't explain to me exactly how the alien got into the wine cellar, but it did explain how I discovered that there were empty bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon, and I discovered this little alien in the story. That's just entertainment. But there are other applications of these things that are much more risky, like medical analysis. We do have very successful examples of the machine learning tools looking at images of cancer cells, looking at images of retinas to test for diabetic retinopathy. These are very successful models, but they're a little bit more risky because if they get the wrong answer, you might not detect a disease that could be harmful. So that's not perfect. And then we have something called hallucinations. And I'll give you an example of this. This is where factual information has gone into the large language model, but counterfactual output emerges when you're in generative mode. So I'll give you an example of my little test. I decided to ask it to write an obituary for me. I know that sounds kind of sad, but here's my reasoning. I thought, well, the obituary form was probably known to the large language model because they're trained off of the internet, and there are lots of obituaries on the internet. So I figured the format would be known to this language model. And then there's stuff about me on the internet, so I figured asking it to write an obituary was probably okay. And it did. It wrote an obituary of about 700 words, and it starts out the way you'd expect. We're sorry to report to you Dr. Cerf passed away. And then it gave a date which was much too soon. I didn't like that part at all. But then it went on to talk about my career. And it mixed up stuff that I did with things other people did. So I got credit for things I didn't do, and other people got credit for the things I did. And then it got to my family members part, and it made up family members that, as far as I know, I don't have. And so I'm scratching my head trying to figure out, well, how could this happen? And I realized that when the large language models are being trained, all they're doing is pulling words off the internet, and they're trying to figure out what's the probability that this word might follow that word or this set of words. It's a big probability engine. Now, the problem is that Professor Murphy's bio and my bio might be on the same web page. The system doesn't know that this paragraph is his bio and this paragraph is my bio. All it does is pluck words off the page and try to figure out what's the probability they might follow each other. So when it's in generative mode, it lacks the context to know that it shouldn't be generating text that's partly from my bio and partly from his. And so it generates counterfactual output. We're trying, we at Google and others are trying to find ways to limit that behavior, but the official word that the experts use is it's hallucination. And so I've been thinking I should do a little video pretending to be Sigmund Freud, because I kind of look like him. Well, what we have yet is the artificial id and the artificial ego. And what we are missing now is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id. I haven't done that video yet, but if I do it, I should do it in German with English subtitles to make it look more realistic. It is a problem, and it's something that is being addressed. There are all kinds of other applications of these large language models and machine learning tools, and they are, in large measure, extremely enabling. And so I'm sure that many jobs will emerge from that. There's a new job, by the way, that's come about just in the last couple of years. It's called prompt engineering. This has nothing to do with engineering at speed. It has to do with figuring out what do you say to a large language model to get it to generate the output that you want. And so that's a new profession, prompt engineering. Just like back in the early 1990s, the job of webmaster didn't exist. it had to be invented by the people who were building the World Wide Web. And of course, these systems are now working across all media, so it's not just words, it's audio and video and imagery and the like. They're very powerful tools. I'm confident that we will learn how to tame these systems, and they will become very powerful enabling tools for many different kinds of work. Now, I'm going to, I do need to mention one other, how are we doing for time here? I'm really rattling along. Have I gone way over time, or am I still okay?
12 minutes past 6.
Okay. Was I supposed, well, if you can...
Very fascinating. So, another couple of minutes?
Okay, all right. So just two things very quickly. First of all, a lot of the technologies that I've been talking about are related to assistive technologies for people with disabilities. My wife, Sigrid, who's in the back, sitting in the mid row there with her hand up, has 2 cochlear implants. She was born with normal hearing, but when she was 3, she lost her hearing. And she had to lip read for 50 years, and then she got a cochlear implant. Now, this is a device that goes into the inner ear with some little electrodes. It's a little snail-like inner ear. And there's a speech processor that takes in sound, and it figures out what frequencies are present, and then it stimulates the electrodes to make the brain think it's hearing sound. And this works. And the reason it works is we understand now how the brain interprets those electrical signals as sound. So at age 53, she gets her cochlear implant. And within about 20 minutes of having turned that thing on, she was able to make a phone call. So we talked for the first time in 30 years of marriage over the phone. And it wasn't a deep conversation, but it was pretty amazing. And then I got home and I couldn't get her off the phone. She was like a teenager, She took any calls that would come in. Telemarketers would call. Now, I was the senior vice president of MCI, a big telephone company at that time, and she got a marketing call from AT&T, one of our competitors. And so she answered the phone, and she asked where the marketer was, and he said he was in India. And she said, oh, well, that's interesting. Your English is very good. Where did you learn that? She went on for half an hour. And of course, this poor guy on the other end says, you're going to switch, aren't you? And she says, no, thanks. My husband works for MCI, but thanks for calling. Then she decided that she was not going to let, any decibels, go undetected. So she got patch cords to plug into the airplane audio so she could hear the sound for a movie and not hear the screaming kid who's 2 seats away. And she got a little microphone that plugs in so she could clip that to the lapel, just like I have a microphone here. For the video. Then she got an FM transmitter and receiver, so I could be up here at the lectern with that thing around my neck, and she could be 150 feet away and still hear me perfectly well. And then she decides she wants to listen to books on tape so she can hear words that she hadn't heard in 50 years. So she calls up the library, and she says, hello. Now, she's on the phone, remember. She says, can I get recorded books for the blind? And they say, oh, of course you can, no problem, name, address, phone number. And then they say, you're blind, aren't you? And she says, no, I'm deaf. And there's this long pause while they're trying to figure out how that's going to work. She ended up listening to 500 books on tape, and she now recognizes accents and misspellings and mispronunciations. But there are all kinds of other things that we can do now. Automatic captioning. I was just showing an application called Live Transcribe for a mobile that takes sound in and then transcribes it. So if you're deaf, you can hear a conversation because you can see it. And of course, we do a lot of that on Google, on YouTube, and on Chrome as well. There are eye trackers that for people who are so disabled that the only thing they can move is their eyes, but they can use their eyes to get the system to move cursors around. And lots of other things like that. Optical implants will be coming, spinal implants will be coming. Eventually, we will be able to design and build systems that are very accessible for people with these various disabilities. Well, in the time that I hope I have left, I wanted to take you into the future. This is a project that began in 1998 after the Pathfinder mission landed successfully on Mars in 1997. We had last successfully landed on Mars in 1976, the Viking 1 and 2. And then for 20 years, nothing worked. You know, the spacecraft burned up in the atmosphere, or they hit the planet, or they missed the planet. I got so excited when I heard about the successful landing that I flew out to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to talk to the people who were handling the communications for this Pathfinder project. And we immediately came to the conclusion that we should start working then, in 1998, on something that we thought we were going to need 25 years later, which is right about now. And what we decided to start working on is an interplanetary extension of the internet. We want to build literally a solar system-wide internet to support manned and robotic space exploration. And in 2004, you remember that Spirit and Opportunity landed in January of that year. They were supposed to transmit data directly back from the surface of Mars to Earth to what's called the Deep Space Network. These are 3 70-meter antennas located at Madrid, Spain, Canberra, Australia, and Goldstone, California. The radios overheated on the Spirit and Opportunity, and the only data rate they were going to get was 28.5 kilobits a second. So we're backing off on the duty cycle to keep the radios from hurting themselves or the instruments. But one of the JPL guys said, you know, we put orbiters around Mars 2 years before to map the surface of Mars to figure out where the rovers are going to go. And those orbiters are still there, and they still have computing power, memory, and transmission capability. And there's an X-band radio on the rovers and an X-band radio on the orbiters. And so we said, we have some prototype software that you might want to try using, and they said, okay. So we uploaded the new interplanetary protocols, which are different from TCP/IP, and it worked. So what happens is that the rovers capture their data, and then they wait till an orbiter gets overhead. They transmit the data up to the orbiter, and it holds onto the data till it gets to the right place in its orbit to transmit the data back to the Deep Space Network. This is called store and forward. Another word for that is packet switching. So we have a packet switch protocol that has been running on Spirit and Opportunity, on the Sojourner, well, not on the Sojourner, Spirit and Opportunity, Curiosity, and all of the other spacecraft that have landed on Mars since 2004 have been using the prototype software for the interplanetary network. And so all of those various missions have benefited from this new design. And what we are anticipating now is that we will return to the moon in the American Artemis mission, in the European Moonlight mission. The Koreans and the Japanese are also involved. We're collaborating, all 4 of the space agencies, on the implementation and test of an interplanetary network. And so as we look towards the 2030s and out, we will actually see this interplanetary network grow mission by mission. As the scientific missions have finished their original work, those spacecraft can be repurposed as nodes of an interplanetary network. And so many of you, will see this unfold over the course of the 21st century. Well, I'll stop there and thank you for your attention and look forward to it.